this has repeatedly been said. The biggest terrorist threat in the United States is white supremacists. This is a fact from the FBI, from Homeland Security. It's indisputable. But no one even considers it that way, right? Nobody thinks about it that way because we have been trained through not only our politicians, our politics, but through media, and not only news media, but also just like how much it's inundated in our culture, right? The fact that this seeps through to every part of our culture. Foreign entity. I'll give you a concrete example. The US yesterday bombed Iraq and Syria, and they called it self-defense. Now, here's the problem with that premise. It assumes that the US presence in Syria and in Iraq is inherently okay, right? There's no questioning to that. Nobody can question that. Like, we're just allowed to be there because, well, we're the US. Yeah. So there's no, the very basic rationality of you cannot be defending yourself on the other side of the planet when you are actually an occupying force on that side of the planet. There's no such thing as self-defense. But this is the logic that works out. And it's the same cognitive sort of dissonance. It's the same mental cause that allows you to assume these inherent, clearly biases that advantage you.
Nonetheless, I think we should be very concerned about Chinese aggression against U.S. warships in the South China Sea. I think there's some self-defense needed there.
But I think this is also
the Iranian ships that were sailing across the Atlantic, right?
Right. Yeah, it might be going to Venezuela.
It was exactly right. So as soon as they entered the hemisphere, it was a threat to the U.S. But U.S. boats, ships, military warcraft in the Persian Gulf, again, just
normal.
Okay.
Well, I think you touched on some very good points there, and I think don't forget when for 500 years you can tell others what to do and how to think, and you are never wrong. You know how deeply that is ingrained into our Western cultures. Like, I always look at it from a more European lens and more Dutch lens, and which was a horrible colonial power that most people seem to ignore because we're such a small little country. But for almost 100 years, they were as bad as Britain, dominating the world with horrible colonialism. And what I really notice is this total lack of introspection when it comes to things that are happening. To such an extent, like you say, when you see something happening in the Middle East, you see bombing over and over of countries completely destroying thousands of years of heritage continuously by the West. And yet people are just unable, in my country, probably large swaths in your country, unable to see why. Why are these people angry? Why are some of them attacking us? It's this total sense of innocence, that deep sense of Western innocence while murdering thousands of people, and it's just baffling to me. It's very hard to understand this total inability to put yourself into someone else's shoes.
Well, I think the process of dehumanization plays a significant role in that, right? Exactly the conversation we were just having about this notion of terrorism. It is not, people do this all the time. If you look at the way US media covers Israel-Palestine, if you look at the way that US media covers domestic terrorism versus foreign terrorism, I mean, this has repeatedly been said. The biggest terrorist threat in the United States is white supremacists. This is a fact from the FBI, from Homeland Security. It's indisputable. But no one even considers it that way, right? Nobody thinks about it that way because we have been trained through not only our politicians, our politics, but through media, and not only news media, but also just how much it's inundated in our culture, right? The fact that this seeps through to every part of our culture. I mean, I'm Iranian American. I was born and raised in the US. But when you are of a different heritage, you pick it up when people are talking about that country of heritage, right? So when Iran is talked about, when Iranians are talked about in the media or in like popular culture, obviously I'm honed in on it in a different way than someone who is not of Iranian heritage, right? Because I'm sensitive to it, because I always think like, oh, they're talking about me.
Right.
And I have so many just unbelievable examples of insane racism against Iranians, right? Like one of the classics that I always use, because I feel like if it happened now, there might be some kind of reaction to it. But in the series Friends, right? Like this very run-of-the-mill, like everybody's heard of this show, everybody's seen it, probably the most popular television show in history. There's a line in the show where Monica's boyfriend is training to be a UFC fighter. She comes out and she says, hey, the person he's about to fight trained in Iran by ripping the arms off of thieves.
Yeah.
And it's not even a blip. It's just, and there's, I mean, the number of examples that exist that are similarly, I just use that one because it's Friends, right? It's like this very friendly, obviously show. And here is, if any other group had been implicated in that comment, there would be backlash, but there's none. Like that didn't happen in the 1990s in the United States. No one cared if you said something like that about Iranians. So this process, when you're constantly vilifying someone, I mean, even the way that right now, as soon as in US media, and when politicians want to make something seem nefarious, they just attach the word Iran backed, and suddenly it's like, oh,
Yeah.
we should be scared because they're Iran backed. And it takes away the agency of the people they're talking about, whether they're Iraqis, whether they're Syrians, whether they're Yemenis, right? It's like nobody has agency. Apparently, Iran is now dominating the entire region.
Not even just the region, Venezuela. Like Iran is often brought up in the context of Venezuela. Like they're spreading their tentacles in South America.
But this is exactly also what Edward Said talked about, the power of language and Orientalist language, in the sense that I think the same effect you have with Hamas. Just throw in the word Hamas and people are triggered by that scary Arab word and thinking about Hollywood movies and evil terrorists. And you immediately won the debate. Oh, Hamas is behind these attacks. Oh, we should support Israel. You know, totally ignoring the fact that Hamas is a resistance movement of an occupied, colonized people. You know what I mean?
And totally ignoring the fact that the Israeli government supported Hamas in its fight against the PLO. That's almost never brought up at all.
That's the innocence.
Hamas was created in like 1987. And so when they talk about the problem is Hamas, what about 1948 until 1987, right? It's like, it's these words, these catchphrases, these talking points that get picked up and they get repeated so often that even if, especially, in fact, if you're a passive listener, right? If you're not entrenched in this information, if you're not studying it, trying to examine it, then all you're hearing is this information in passing. Yeah. And if that's all you're hearing, then once, to your point, once you hear it in the media, you're triggered by it. It's like, oh yeah, I've heard that, it's bad. And that's about it. That's about all the information that individual might know about this.